My name is Brielle, and at 34 years old, I make my living calculating the precise moment of death. As a senior actuary for one of the largest insurance firms in Chicago, my entire life revolves around the cold science of risk assessment. I spend my days staring at spreadsheets filled with human lives, and I determine the mathematical probability of disaster. My office on the 45th floor is a fortress of silence and polished steel, a place far removed from the chaotic poverty I grew up in. From this height, the city of Chicago looks like a massive circuit board, logical and orderly. I do not make decisions based on emotion. I make them based on facts, numbers, and the bottom line. On my mahogany desk, there sits a single silver frame that contrasts sharply with my high-tech monitors. It is a faded photograph of my grandparents standing proudly in front of their brownstone in Bronzeville. I did not start my life on the 45th floor. I came from the burning streets where every dollar was a battle. I remember my grandfather coming home with hands calloused from manual labor, and my grandmother weary from cleaning houses that were never her own. They saved every single penny, nickel, and dime for 30 years to buy that piece of Chicago history. To them, that house was not just brick and mortar. It was proof that we existed. It was the only victory our bloodline had ever truly won. The silence of my office was shattered when my desk phone buzzed. I checked the caller ID and saw it was Mr. Sterling, my real estate attorney. He was a man who billed $400 an hour and never called unless a contract was being breached. I answered on the second ring. His voice was tight with professional anxiety. "Brielle, the neighbors just called the precinct," he said. "They said there is loud music blasting from the property and someone has parked a rusted SUV right on the front lawn. They thought you had already sold the place, but I told them the deed is still in your name." I capped my fountain pen with a sharp metallic click. I did not panic. Panic is a variable that leads to poor outcomes. Instead, a cold and calculated fury began to settle in my chest. That house was the most important contract of my life, a physical manifestation of my grandparents' sacrifice. Someone was trespassing on my legacy, and I was already calculating the cost of their mistake. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and prepared to settle the account. I gripped the steering wheel of my sedan as I began the long drive south toward Bronzeville. The transition from the gleaming glass towers of downtown to the weathered brick of the South Side always felt like a journey through different layers of time. Every intersection I crossed triggered a vivid memory that flashed behind my eyes. I passed the corner grocery store with the faded red awning where my grandfather used to take me every Saturday morning. He would reach into his worn leather wallet to pull out a single-dollar bill to buy me a piece of peppermint candy. That small gesture was his way of telling me that despite our struggle, there was still sweetness to be found. I drove past the local park where I spent countless summer nights sitting on a hard wooden bench under a flickering street lamp. I stayed there until 2 a.m. studying my calculus textbooks because the house was too loud and the streets were too dangerous. I had used those books as a ladder to climb out of the poverty that threatened to swallow my entire family. As I turned onto the familiar street of my childhood, the knot in my stomach tightened. The historic brownstones stood like weary soldiers guarding the secrets of the past. Then I saw it. My heart skipped a beat before hammering against my ribs with a violent intensity. Parked directly on the lush green grass of the front yard was a rusted-out and oil-leaking SUV. It belonged to Darnell, the man my sister Tiana had married against every piece of advice I had ever given her. My grandfather had spent 50 years meticulously tending to that lawn, treating every blade of grass as if it were a sacred gift. Seeing that heavy metal machine crushing the earth he had loved felt like a physical blow to my face. This was not merely a case of simple trespassing or a family misunderstanding. This was a calculated insult to the blood and sweat of the people who were no longer here to defend themselves. Tiana and Darnell knew exactly what this house meant to me, and yet they chose to treat it like a cheap motel. A hot and searing anger surged through my veins, but I forced my mind to remain sharp and cold. I did not pull into the driveway. I parked on the street and took a deep breath to center my focus. I reached into my bag and gripped the heavy brass key alongside the legal injunction papers Mr. Sterling had prepared for me months ago as a precaution. I did not intend to knock on the door with my fist like a desperate relative begging for entrance. I was going to open that door with the absolute authority of the rightful owner. I entered the house using the spare key I always kept in my purse. The moment the door swung open, a wave of foul odors hit my nose, making me flinch in pure disgust. This was no longer the gentle scent of lemon oil, oak polish, and lavender that my grandmother had nurtured for over 50 years. Instead, the air was thick with the smell of cheap fast food grease, stale cigarette smoke, and the heavy stench of marijuana clinging to the vintage velvet curtains. I saw empty takeout boxes scattered carelessly across the hardwood floor and dark stains on the ivory sofa that I had just paid $2,000 to have professionally steam cleaned. Tiana walked out from the kitchen area with a smug expression, as if she owned the entire city of Chicago. She was wearing a tattered tracksuit, holding a half-empty soda can, and looking at me with a fake smile plastered on her face. "Oh, you are back," Brielle Tiana said in a casual tone that was absolutely infuriating. "Do not look at me with that judgmental face. We are actually doing you a massive favor by watching this place for you. You know the neighborhood has gone to trash lately, and squatters would have stripped this place bare if we had not moved in to protect it." I did not say a single word until I stepped into the very center of the living room. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the original deed of ownership, along with the formal eviction notice and the emergency injunction papers that were freshly stamped with red court seals. I held the documents up right in front of her eyes. I do not need a house sitter, and I certainly do not need a sister who illegally changes my locks to turn a historic landmark into a filthy den, I replied, in a voice that was as cold as a Chicago winter. Immediately, the casual mask slipped from Tiana's face, replaced by a familiar and toxic aggression. She began a loud and rehearsed performance about the sanctity of blood and family sacrifice. "You always think you are so much better than us with your fancy job and your expensive suits," Tiana screamed, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. "Family is supposed to come first, but you are just a cold-blooded sellout who only cares about money and selling this legacy to the highest bidder. You are heartless and greedy for trying to kick your own flesh and blood out onto the street." I looked at my younger sister and felt a profound sense of exhaustion. Tiana had always been the golden child, the one our mother pampered, while I was forced to be the responsible one. She had spent every single cent of our mother's Social Security checks for the past 5 years, and now that there was nothing left to drain, she was trying to hijack the only tangible thing our grandparents had left behind. She called me greedy while she stood in a house she did not pay for, eating food she did not earn, and attempting to steal a future she did not build. The conflict between us was not about a building. It was about the fact that she viewed my hard work as her personal inheritance. I pushed past Tiana and marched toward the formal dining room, the very space where my grandmother used to host Sunday dinners for the church elders. What I saw inside made my blood run cold with a new level of fury. There were at least 6 people gathered around the antique mahogany table, including a few familiar faces from the old neighborhood, and several men I assumed were friends of Darnell. They were drinking cheap beer and eating ribs, leaving greasy thumbprints on the wood that had been hand-polished for decades. A portable speaker was thumping a heavy bass line that made the crystal chandelier vibrate in protest. It looked like a victory celebration, a housewarming party for a home they had stolen. Darnell was leaning back in my grandfather's velvet armchair, his muddy boots resting right on the seat cushion. He was holding a plastic cup high in the air and laughing loudly. "I am telling you, all this is just the beginning," Darnell announced to the room, completely ignoring my presence at first. "We are going to tear out these old walls and turn this place into the premier entertainment spot in Bronzeville. We will have a lounge downstairs and a private club upstairs, and we will be the kings of this block by the end of the summer." The guests cheered and toasted to his delusion, while I stood in the doorway, feeling like a stranger in my own inheritance. In that moment, a chilling realization washed over me. This was not just a temporary place for them to crash because they were broke. This was a calculated legal maneuver. By inviting neighbors over by being loud and visible, and by establishing a public presence, they were building a case for squatter rights. They wanted the community to see them as the residents, so that when I finally tried to kick them out, they could claim they had been living here openly with permission. They were trying to create a legal nightmare that would take me years and thousands of dollars in legal fees to resolve. They were not just guests, they were parasites trying to burrow into the foundation of my life. Tiana came up behind me and put a hand on my shoulder, her voice dripping with a fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Come on, Brielle, don't be like that," she whispered. "Just sit down and have a drink with us. We can talk about a lease agreement later, but for now, just let us be a family." I shook her hand off me with such force that she stumbled back against the doorframe. I did not reach for my contact list to call our mother because I knew she would only beg me to be patient and give them another chance. I did not waste another second on negotiation or emotional pleas. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed 911 with steady fingers. I spoke clearly to the dispatcher, giving the address and reporting a group of individuals who had broken into a historic property and were currently destroying the interior. I was done playing the role of the supportive sister, and it was time for the law to take out the trash. While the dispatcher kept me on the line, I began a slow and agonizing walk through the house to assess the wreckage. My chest felt tight, as if an invisible hand were squeezing my heart with every step I took. When I reached the grand foyer, I stopped dead in my tracks and let out a strangled gasp. Darnell had taken a bucket of cheap, flat white latex paint and covered every inch of the hand-carved oak crown moldings. These were the original features from 1920, the very pride of my grandfather. He had spent 30 years polishing that wood until it shone like dark honey, telling me stories of how the craftsman had labored over each curve. Now it was buried under a thick and sloppy coat of white paint that looked like a scar across the history of our family. He had stripped the soul out of the room to make it look like a sterile, modern apartment. I felt a sudden jolt of panic and ran toward the small room at the back that served as my grandfather's private study. I remembered the heavy scent of tobacco and the soul-stirring sound of music that used to drift from that doorway. My eyes flew to the corner where the custom-built mahogany shelves stood. They were empty. My grandfather had spent 40 years building a rare collection of jazz vinyl records, original pressings from artists like Duke Ellington and Count Basie. There were over 500 albums in that collection, a treasure trove of black excellence and personal joy. I turned to Tiana, who had followed me into the room with a defensive scowl. "Where are the records?" "Tiana," I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. She crossed her arms and looked at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes at first. "Darnell had some bills to pay, Brielle," she finally muttered. "He found some guy on eBay who bought the whole lot for $3,000. It was just a bunch of dusty old plastic anyway, and we needed the cash for the security deposit on his truck and to settle some debts with his bookie." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the reality of their betrayal sank in. They had sold 40 years of history for $3,000 to cover a gambling debt. Those records were not just plastic. They were the heartbeat of a man who worked until his bones ached so he could have one small piece of beauty in a world that tried to deny him everything. I stood there in the middle of the empty study, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was watching the spirits of my grandparents being torn apart by the very people who carried their blood. This was not just theft. It was a desecration of everything we were supposed to stand for as a family. My sister and her husband were not just living in the house. They were burning the memories to keep themselves warm for a single night. Gemini and I heard a massive crash echoing from the back of the house, a dry and splintering sound of masonry and ancient timber giving way. I rushed toward the kitchen and witnessed a scene of absolute devastation that made my breath catch in my throat. Darnell was standing there with a heavy sledgehammer in his grip, his skin slick with sweat, and his face twisted into a smirk of pure, unadulterated ignorance. He had completely demolished the primary wall that separated the kitchen from the formal dining room. Jagged pieces of plaster and broken bricks were strewn across the floor like the aftermath of a bomb blast. He looked at me and flashed a yellowed grin, bragging that he was creating an open-concept floor plan to make the place look modern for his entertainment lounge. As I looked at the thick cloud of grayish-white dust hanging in the air and settling onto my lungs, my actuarial mind immediately triggered a red alert. I knew with absolute certainty that houses built in the 1920s were notorious for using asbestos in the insulation and plaster layers. By tearing down those walls with such reckless force and zero professional containment, Darnell had released millions of toxic, microscopic fibers into every single corner of the living space. This was no longer a matter of aesthetics or a messy renovation. This was a public health catastrophe. Those invisible particles were silent killers, and Darnell had just signed a long-term death warrant for anyone breathing the air in this building. Worse still, as I looked up at the ceiling, I saw long, jagged cracks beginning to spiderweb across the plaster at an alarming rate. The wall he had just obliterated was not a simple decorative partition. It was a primary load-bearing wall designed to support the massive weight of the second floor and the heavy slate roof above. Through his criminal lack of structural knowledge, Darnell had compromised the very integrity of the entire building. The historic brownstone was now in imminent danger of a structural collapse. My anger shifted from personal betrayal to a cold and clinical assessment of a crime. This was no longer a family dispute about who had the right to live in a house. This was a felony. He had destroyed a protected landmark, created a lethal environmental hazard, and placed the lives of everyone inside at immediate risk. I looked into the eyes of Tiana and Darnell as they stood there looking confused, and I realized I no longer felt any bond of blood with them. They were dangerous variables that had to be removed to protect the legacy my grandparents had bled for. The sirens wailed as 3 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their blue and red lights dancing against the stained glass windows of the foyer. The neighborhood was watching now, but I did not turn away in shame. As the officers stepped onto the porch, my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The screen displayed the name Miss Eloise. It was my mother. I knew this call was not coming from a place of concern or a desire to hear my side of the story. I answered the phone and was immediately met with a wall of high-pitched screaming that made my ear throb. "Brielle, what have you done?" My mother shrieked, her voice cracking with a forced theatricality. "I just got a frantic text from Tiana saying the police are there with handcuffs." "Are you really going to be the demon who puts your own sister in jail? Have you no soul left in that body of yours?" She did not ask if I was safe. She did not ask about the hazardous dust filling the house or the structural damage that threatened to bring the roof down. To her, the only crime was my refusal to be a victim. She began to weaponize our faith, quoting scriptures about forgiveness and honoring thy mother and father. She told me that I was bringing a permanent stain of dishonor onto the family name, and that the ancestors would be weeping in their graves to see me acting so heartless toward my own flesh and blood. I stood in the middle of the debris watching the officers confront Darnell near the shattered wall. I felt a cold clarity settle over me that I had never experienced before. "Mother, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. "You are talking to me about honor while you defend 2 people who just sold every single one of Grandpa's jazz records for pennies to pay off a gambling debt. You are calling me a demon while Tiana stands by and watches her husband destroy the very foundation of the home that your parents bled and suffered to build." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 34 years of being the responsible daughter finally lifting off my shoulders. "You claim to love this family, but you seem to love your dishonest son-in-law and your lazy daughter more than you respect the memory of the people who actually gave you a life." I continued, "I am not the one dishonoring this name. I am the only one left with the courage to protect it from the parasites you raised. If you want to choose them over the truth, then that is your burden to carry, but the police are staying and the locks are being changed today." I hung up the phone before she could utter another word, silencing the noise of her manipulation for the first time in my life. Mr. Sterling stepped onto the porch just as the environmental inspectors arrived with their specialized testing equipment. The scene was chaotic, but I remained as still as a statue, watching the consequences of arrogance unfold. Darnell was being led out in handcuffs, his bravado having completely evaporated. He was not just being charged with criminal trespassing and destruction of property. The inspectors had already confirmed the presence of airborne asbestos, meaning he was now facing severe felony charges for biological safety violations and the endangerment of a historical landmark. His face was pale, and he looked smaller than I had ever seen him stripped of the power he thought he could steal from me. Tiana collapsed onto the dusty floor, her cries echoing through the hollowed-out rooms. She grabbed at the hem of my coat, tears streaming down her face in a desperate performance. "Brielle, please," she sobbed. "You cannot do this to me. I am pregnant with his child and we have nowhere else to go." She looked up at me with eyes that expected me to soften, but for the first time in my life, I saw her for exactly who she was. I did not see my sister. I did not see a grieving family member. I saw a complete stranger who had spent her entire existence trying to trade on my guilt. I looked at her hand on my coat and felt nothing but a profound sense of detachment. I stepped back, letting her hand fall onto the debris. Whether that child was real or another lie to manipulate me did not matter anymore. My responsibility to her ended the moment she chose to dismantle my soul. The officers eventually cleared the house, removing the last of the party guests and the 2 people who had almost destroyed my inheritance. Within 2 hours, a specialized security team I had summoned arrived to install a state-of-the-art surveillance system with biometric locks and 32 high-definition cameras. As the sun began to set over Bronzeville, I stood alone in the center of the living room. The house was a wreck filled with toxic dust and scarred wood, but it was finally quiet. The silence was not empty. It was peaceful. I realized then that a hard boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the highest form of self-respect. I had spent 34 years trying to save people who were determined to drown, and today I finally decided to swim to shore. The following morning, I drove to the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. I walked through the rows of headstones until I reached the simple marble marker where my grandparents rested together. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I reached out and touched the cold stone, feeling a sense of closure that no bank account or corporate title could ever provide. "I have kept the house," I whispered into the quiet air. "It is safe now, and so am I." I turned away and walked back to my car, ready to build a future that was no longer anchored by the weight of toxic loyalty. In the tapestry of life, family is often the strongest thread, but even the strongest thread can become a noose if it's used to strangle your growth. True legacy isn't just about preserving brick and mortar, it's about honoring the values of those who came before us through our own integrity. Setting a boundary is not an act of hatred, but a profound declaration of self-love. You are not responsible for the dysfunction you didn't create, and you owe no loyalty to those who demand you sacrifice your peace to finance their irresponsibility. Choose freedom over guilt.